Greeting, folks. We're going to talk today about the local education agency, otherwise known as the school board, what they must do, what they may do, and what they can't do. So, just give you an idea of who these folks are and how you fit into that whole scheme of things. So, you can imagine that with the education in Tennessee, uh, unlike the U.S. Constitution, Tennessee recognizes not only the importance of education, but the fact that we are required by law to provide a free system of public education. And that's right in the Tennessee Constitution. Uh, so, one of the things you need to know, first of all, when you're talking about boards of education, they are public corporations. Now, that sounds like a legal fiction, but they, in fact, are, under the law, considered a corporate body. That means they can both sue and be sued. School boards get sued frequently over civil rights cases in federal and state court. And the reason you'll see them in federal or state court because they're either going to have a cause of action evoking the United States Constitution or federal law, or the state constitution. As you might know, probably know that Tennessee has its own civil rights statute. And then personal injury, also known as tort law, which you'll see later in the program or in the modules. Contracts, school boards contract for all kinds of things, and as a result, they enter into contracts, and oftentimes lawsuits are filed over those. Election cases, school board members are elected officials, separately elected officials, and these days they are now partisan races, which is relatively new. Land use and planning, the school boards have the ability to condemn property, to purchase property, to, of course, build. Uh, Violations of various ordinances that affect the school system. HR, people suing the school board employees for everything from unemployment compensation, labor and employment law. So just a wide variety of lawsuits and anything related to the school, everything from the education of children to injuries occurred on school property as a result of the operation of school board owned vehicles. But again, a hotbed of litigation. That's why most school boards have a rather active legal department. So basically, in Tennessee, three kinds of school boards. You've got your county school boards, uh, city or municipal school boards, or consolidated school boards like Knox County. For instance, Knox County used to have a Knox County schools and Knox City of Knoxville schools. They combine those into a uniform school system, as have other counties like Metro Davidson. But one thing they have in common is they are uh, run by elected board members, and their duty and responsibility is to hire a school superintendent, also known as a director of schools. Since 1992, we appoint and not elect the school superintendent. Prior to that, school superintendents were separately elected, and you can imagine the conflict between an elected board and an elected superintendent. So it could be argued that the most important decision a school board makes is to hire its superintendent. Um, Knox County, for instance, under their charter, they established a board of education that there's only two counties in the state of 95 counties that have a charter, Knox County and Shelby. I only mention this because there are some oddities out there. So the Knox County Charter specifically outlines the duties and responsibilities of the local education agency, also known as the school board, rather than just relying on statute. The city of Lenore City, uh, they have their own separate school system, separate from Loudoun County, and again, they have their own charter. So basically, uh, you got to remember that school boards, boards of education, are bodies politic, but they're considered basically political subdivisions of the state. And that means their power and authority is going to come from the state legislature. They pass statutes and codes In other words, your Tennessee codes passed by the legislature, they are eventually put into bound volumes, also online, but they're annotated because, again, what they will have is not merely the law, but an explanation of the law. And there are 71 chapters. What we'll always be worried about or concerned with, of course, is Chapter 49, which is the education chapter of the Tennessee Code. And another thing you have to remember is there is the Tennessee Administrative Code. Now, this basically, the TAC, is all of the power and authority given to the Board of Education, and they promulgate or create certain rules and regulations. So these are ancillary to the Tennessee Code. The Tennessee Administrative Code, as you'll see as you review the modules, is a separate writing, but it can't be in conflict with the Tennessee Code. But again, you'll refer to that oftentimes because these are created by an agency. They're agency created, in other words, the Department of Education. But they have to be followed with the same force and effect as law because the legislature delegated to the Board of Education, the Tennessee Department of Education, the ability to create these various rules and regulations. So basically, again, elected members, these are now partisan races. They have 4-year terms and they may succeed themselves. So there's really no term limits there. And in order to essentially run, you'll have to have a high school diploma or GED. You cannot be both a teacher and a member of the board. And you can't likewise contemporaneously be a member of the county legislative body and the Department of Education because the county legislative body funds the Board of Education. So local school boards, again, they run the show with state guidance, but nevertheless, they are locally elected, and the folks who elect them expect the board to carry out the local culture of the community. And working together, the whole idea is to provide a fair and complete and free education for children. Now, a lot of conflicts arise recently about school board meetings. We'll get to that another day. But school boards now have come under fire. For years, they were under the radar. Now they've become quite popular. So basically, bottom line, voters elect the Board of Education. Board of Education selects a superintendent. They adopt policies, goals. They have direct communication with their constituents, the community. Superintendent hires staff and basically carries out the goals and objectives of the Board of Education, again, also known as the local education agency. So, mandatory duties of the board: manage and control the schools, appoint the superintendent, establish policies, adopt a budget, elect a chairperson, and they grant tenure upon recommendation of the school superintendent. They also have the ability, and they should be visiting schools to basically see how things are progressing. They do have the ability to dismiss teachers, principals, and supervisors for neglect of duty. They can also terminate the contract of the school superintendent. School superintendents have a contract with the school board, and the school board is empowered to terminate that contract for cause, or depending upon what kind of contract they negotiated. They direct an evaluation plan, also deal with the safety of the schools, again, under the advise and counsel with the school superintendent. And they have permissive powers as well. They can consolidate schools. They can employ their own legal counsel. They don't have to use the counsel that's provided to them by a city council or a county commission. They can establish child care programs. They can determine the use of their property. Do they want a nonprofit organization to be able to use their property during the summer, for instance, as for various functions, everything from Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Girls Incorporated, other organizations. They alone determine whether or not a third party can use their property, even as an emergency shelter. They can dispose of property. In other words, they can sell off property that they no longer have a use for. They can close schools, lease their buildings, and of course, determine how safe they want their schools. In other words, do they want to employ school resource officers They don't have to, they may. Then, of course, prohibited acts. They can't have a conflict of interest. Nepotism, hiring relatives, entering into contracts for which they can benefit, engage in any kind of discrimination. And that also is going to include, of course, gender preference and sexual orientation. They can't engage in unfair labor practices, can't use the public property for private profit. And they, again, can't be both a teacher and a school board member. So what about the superintendent of schools, and how does it affect the board? Again, superintendent of schools works directly for the board. So they approve positions and salaries. They determine who to employ with the, of course, permission of the board. In terms of if they want to start creating new positions, that may require a adjustment to the budget. The schools in general will take that before the board. But their job is to hire people and act as the human resources director. But of course, they'll have a professional, usually human resources director. But again, hiring, disciplining, etc. Whether or not personnel should be transferred back and forth. And again, a lot of this is going to depend upon what various policies the board itself has passed that the superintendent has to belong to or adhere to. And again, when it comes to dismissals, making sure there is a hearing, it is fair and impartial, due process is involved, and then ultimately bringing this before the board for final approval, depending on the county or city. But again, making recommendations about people who should no longer work for the Board of Education. Tenure again, recommended by the LEA, the Director of Schools. The LEA is going to grant or deny the tenure upon the Director's recommendation, and the Director of Schools or the School Superintendent determine whether or not there should be a non-renewal of a teacher or recommendation. But again, you see this interplay. The LEA has the final say upon recommendation of the Director. Basically, the Director can accept resignations. Doesn't have to go before the board. So if a principal says, I'm out of here, I resign, the superintendent can accept that resignation. Where you're always going to have conflict is when employees who work for the school superintendent don't like the school superintendent or don't like the way the superintendent is running things, so they run to the board. And that's always going to be a conflict, because then the elected officials are basically getting involved with day-to-day personnel matters, which they should not unless it's dealing with something like tenure. But your typical grievances, problems, there's a chain of command for that ends with the school superintendent. Again, they can make assignments, develop employment contracts with principals, normally in conjunction with the legal department and HR. And again, approve the budget. What will happen here is ultimately the local education agency will adopt a budget. They present it then to what's called the local legislative body, and they will local legislative body, either a county commission or a city council, will approve or reject the total budget. They can't nitpick. They can't sit there and start approving this. They either have to approve the budget as submitted or reject it. And there's a whole body of law as to what the terms and conditions are. Generally, a school board, a budget can't be rejected merely because the county commission or city council doesn't like it. It either has to be illegal, or the budget has, there's been such a diminution or a reduction in enrollment that the county commission or the city commission can say, well, sorry, but you lost 500 kids this year because of the economy, so we're going to reduce your budget accordingly. But those battles go on all the time because most boards of education are not self-funding. They can't levy taxes like the school board or the county, or rather a county commission or a city council can. So as a result, they have to rely on that. There are some self-funding school boards, but they're rare. Then again, there's going to be submitting reports of the Board of Education will submit periodical reports to the local legislative body, the city council, county commission for review. But again, that's just communication to ensure everyone knows where the money's going and how things are progressing. If the relationship is good between the two bodies, these things are usually pro forma. They'll submit it. Rarely do they get into conflict unless the school board and the county commission or city council are at odds, which does happen. And again, you've got the ability to make purchases, and the school board has to make purchases because they don't create anything, so they're buying everything from computers to toilet paper. And the county commission does have a right to take a look at those things to make sure that the money's being spent properly. But again, they only get involved if they suspicion something illegal or improper is going on. The local education agency basically is responsible for building schools. Now, sometimes county mayors or city mayors say, "No, it's our job." It's not by law. It's the school board's job to do all that. The local education, the local body politics, county or city, provides the funding or will float bonds to do that. But they don't get involved in the day-to-day building. They want to because they're floating the money, but generally the law precludes that. Then, of course, there's the mandatory reporting of child abuse. If you are involved at all in the school system, you are a mandatory reporter. And notice, any school official, personnel, employee, or member of the Board of Education who is aware of any kind of misconduct regarding child or sexual abuse will report this. And there are people sometimes who just don't do that. They just think, I don't want to get involved. I don't know all the facts. You have an absolute duty. And unless it's malicious, you've actually manufactured it, you don't have any liability. So if you in good faith report it, turns out to be untrue, you're not on the hook to get sued because you did it in good faith. So again, while on school grounds, and school grounds is a broad thing. If you're on a field trip, that extends the location of the school. So the bottom line is, when in doubt, report it. And also, you can see all these people who are involved in that process. Once a report is made, everybody gets involved. Multiple agencies, everything from the juvenile court, personnel, social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, police departments, district attorney's office, therapists, lawyers. So once that call is made and that's put into motion, and it turns out to be a valid complaint about abuse, it's a lot of moving parts. Okay, well, I say questions, but that's the bottom line. That is basically the interplay between the Board of Education and the local funding agency, county or city, and just give you an idea of the power and authority of school boards and school superintendents. Thank you for your time.